Welcome back, everybody, to a new episode of Podcast on the Brink. This week, Matt Cox of the Three Man Weave is here. One of my favorite college basketball publications. They actually teamed up this year and were a driving force behind the Almanac, which is a great resource for college basketball fans. If you have not picked that up, I strongly suggest that you do as you get ready for the meat of the non-conference schedule here in Big Ten season. Matt, welcome back to the show.
Pleasure to be back. 1-0, and we're off and running. The Indiana Hoosiers is a convincing Morehead State defeat. So, yeah, I'm good, man. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. We were talking a little bit beforehand. Expectations for this season for Indiana. It's been a while, I think really since the Romeo year where Indiana, I think that was the last time Indiana was ranked in the preseason. Been a little bit of a variation between where you see them in some of these preseason rankings. You know, you study the country as closely as anybody. Where are you at with this team kind of to start the season, and what maybe I guess are the scenarios, maybe like the ceiling and the floor for this group?
Yeah, I think I started off like midsummer, more on the bearish end of the spectrum with the expectations for this team, but my optimism grew rosier as the fall crept upon us, and now I am not fully, but 75 to 80% drinking the hype Kool-Aid. Now quantifying that in terms of rankings, I had Illinois as my official Big Ten title pick. I had Indiana a slight hair below them, which I think was an unpopular opinion. But I think right now, at this point in time, November 9th, 2022, Indiana is the best team in the Big Ten. I think it's just the most stable. A lot of these rosters like Michigan and Illinois, who I think actually have maybe higher upside than IU, maybe. They have a lot more to figure out at this point. But I think the point you alluded to, right, is what's the ceiling and floor? I think IU has the highest floor of any top 20 team in the nation. I just think their defense and the continuity and their experience is such a soothing element to this team that, like, we can debate, are they top 15, top 10, top 5, whatever. To me, it's like, I think we're a pretty good bet to, be a top 6, top 5, top 4 seed and higher. Now, how high into that ladder we climb, we'll find out. It's going to be a lot of, can you get that big road or 2 or 3 victory in Big Ten play? But I think the floor is as high as any team in the country. I really do. The ceiling you can debate. That's where I think you got to go back and forth on. But the interior defense gives you one of the strongest floors of any team in the country.
So one of the things that I've struggled with when looking at this team, full disclosure, I also picked Illinois. I voted in the unofficial
really?
media poll this season for the It's hard for me to look at what Indiana did last season. They finished 48th in KenPom, right? They are a second half Michigan comeback away from not even making the tournament. I think a lot of it happened, so obviously we have to account for that. But also on the flip side, it's not like this team was some type of powerhouse last year. So they returned most of their pieces from last season. They get rid of some of the parts that probably needed to be extracted from the roster and bring in some really good freshmen, but you still have that burned in memory in your head of last season. They were 48th in KenPom. Yep. We're running it back with most of the same guys. What kind of gives you the confidence that they can take this leap to be a consistent top 25 team? Is it just TJG coming back? Is it Hood-Schifino, Renew, a combination of these things? I know you mentioned the defense. It's just hard for me to get to the leap of, hey, this is a top 15 team when we saw them last season. They were average Big Ten team, right? They're 7-11 in the league, lower half of the standings.
Yeah, I think they were playing better late, right? I think we saw signs of a mini leap developing. So if you just want to, and this is where I think preseason prognostication's hairy, right? You can move the goalpost to suit your argument. But if you believe in what you saw the last, 7-ish games, right? Coinciding with Xavier Johnson's nuclear scorched earth run. You can see signs of this was close to a top 30-ish team last year at the very end, right? And that's even with that's with all breaking right, specifically Xavier Johnson, Mr. Jekyll and Hyde being whoever's the good guy in Mr. Jekyll and Hyde, right? Being the best version of himself consistently 9 in 9 out those last 6-7 games. So I think you enter this year with the expectation of, if you believe what you saw, if you believe Xavier Johnson is not a feast or famine guy, you believe he's actually a legit game-breaking point guard, well, then you go from there. You add in the 2 5-star freshmen who I love both of them. I wish one was more of a shooter, a shot maker, just to kind of fill out the hole on this roster. But Hood-Schifino's ability just to make plays from the pick and roll. And then, man, Renew's been phenomenal from what I've heard this offseason. Obviously, I saw a little bit of the Morehead State game. It looks like he's the real deal. So I think all those pieces, you can come up with a pretty sound argument that this could be a top 10 team. But I do think it's a bit of a leap based on, you're right, coming off last season with so many of the same guys, so many experienced guys. And I think the final piece is where you're probably looking at is the sophomores and Tamar Bates and Geronimo and some of the fringe freshmen, maybe kind of giving you an incremental boost, but tough to say.
Yeah. Shooting was obviously, it's been an issue for a long time. Do you think they did enough to address that? Or, I mean, they only took 11 threes in the first game. Mike Woodson talked post game that he didn't think it was a big deal because they kind of took with that game, what was available against Morehead State, which is basically go inside and shoot layups rather than shooting threes. I just kind of wonder it feels like you have to start making more threes if you're Indiana at some point. I'm not saying they have to make, a huge volume more, but at the same time, when you're getting into these high level games in non-conference play, you're going to be able to get by against North Carolina or Kansas or Arizona making 4 3-pointers. I don't know the answer to that question. I also don't know that they really addressed to me, that's the biggest hole in the roster was, are you going to, is Miller Kopp all of a sudden going to start taking 7 or 8 threes a game? Right. I just don't know that I see that.
Yeah, I think it's the Miller Kopp conundrum, right? I think there's a lot of Indiana fans who would like to see other guys be getting his minutes. They just see maybe greater upside, more dynamism in the alternative options. However, I think Kopp is arguably your safest shooter plus all around. You can argue how good of a defender he is. I think he's sufficient. He's long. I think he understands Woodson's scheme. I think he's a smart player. I'm not the biggest fan of his overall, but I do think he's probably the guy that you have to rely on to make shots. But again, playing him and relying on him sort of limits your ceiling, I would also argue, right? Those are minutes that could be going to Hood-Schifino and maybe Hood-Schifino, Xavier Johnson, 2 quasi point guard lineups. These also taking minutes from, I don't know, pick your poison of, if you're a Jordan Geronimo breakout believer, well, then there you go. You're your Tamar Bates believer, well, then that's one right there too. That's been the thing with IU, I think, even before the Woodson era, right? Is like there's so many guys and there's so much quantity that you look at the roster, it's like, man, we have 5 top 100 guys sitting there at the bottom of our bench. But when you rate team, you really only need 7, right? Like at the end of the day, when it comes down to crunch time late in the season, you really only need 7. So I think over the course of the year, this depth will help IU, and I think actually bodes well for racking up good resume metrics and such. But I also worry that we overrate this team because of the sheer depth when the incremental value added as you go from 6 to 7 to 8 to 10 to 12 on the roster just diminishes. You can only play 5 at one time, unfortunately.
I want to go lightning round here on these non-conference games that are coming up because I know you study this as much as anybody. These teams, and they're going to start coming here pretty quickly later in the month. Obviously, next week there's Indiana at Xavier. There's North Carolina, Kansas, Arizona. As much as you want to say, or as little you want to say, what can we expect out of each of these opponents, and big picture how I think each of them is a little bit different in terms of the scenario. You got a neutral court game in there. You got a road game. You got a home game. To me, I've said kind of in the preseason, if Indiana splits these 4 games, that would probably be a pretty good performance overall. Would you agree with that? And just kind of your thoughts on each of those 4 teams and what they each bring to the table?
Yeah, for Xavier, North Carolina, Arizona, Kansas. Yeah, I think a split would be, frankly, great. I think if you're doing the over-under, it's probably 1.5. It's probably closer to 1.75. But yeah, 1.5 would be the right set the line. Xavier's a little bit dicey to start. They have some roster question marks. I'm a big... huge Sean Miller fan. I think he'll have that thing going. But Indiana, this is a smart schedule spot because we play them at the right time, right? This is what I think smart scheduling is all about. You're trying to catch teams early in the year that may not be the full versions of who they are, but then at the end of the year on Selection Sunday, that metric will look really good on your resume. I think Xavier's a win. Ken Pom has as a 2-point win. I think Indiana will. I think it should play closer, like a 5 or 6 point type game. And then UNC, that's a winnable game. A game we should win. I'm kind of out on UNC this season. I think they caught lightning in a bottle last year. Yes, they're very talented. Yes, they can score. Pete Nance coming back to Assembly Hall, so he knows he's kind of an important piece for that team that I think will help them against IU's front line. As big as Baycott is, I think TJD and Race and Malik can body. So yeah, I think IU actually wins the first two, and then they lose to Kansas at Fog Allen. It's just too much of a task. Just to go in there and win is impossible. Arizona's the toss-up. I think we probably lose that game too. They looked really good. I'm kind of an Arizona believer this year. So that's more of where you fall on the Wildcats. They have a lot of guys back. They're huge up front. So we do match up well with them. I just think they're a little bit more talented than we are. So I'd say 2-2 is my prediction, but I'm setting the line at 1.5 for those 4.
Yeah, I think 2-2 would be really good. Just in terms of setting the table.
2-2, you're pleased. Yep. 2-2, you're pleased. That means you finished the non-con at what?
9-2.
That would be 9-2. Yeah, it's a great spot.
And you have plenty of opportunities, obviously, in the Big Ten to kind of bolster your resume. Although I wonder in the Big Ten this season, with it being down, is there going to be, even if you do win the Big Ten, are we talking about a Big Ten where, and Andy Bottoms kind of alluded to this in the preseason bracketology, he could see, the Big Ten champion may not get a protected seed or could be a 4 seed. We saw that, I think it was like 2015-16. Indiana won the Big Ten that year, and I think they were a 5 seed and had to play Kentucky the second round. They obviously
that's right. Yeah. Yep.
To the Sweet 16. But is it feasible this year in the Big Ten with kind of the lack of maybe a power teams at the top that you're talking about a lower seed maybe for the champion?
Yeah, and that's the problem is I think we're going to have a lot of parity once we get into league play. The imbalance scheduling, the timing will be unfortunately just like really big forces in determining how the standings shake out. I do agree with you. I've said this narrative the last few seasons, so I feel like a broken record and I feel like it's a lazy take. It's especially true this year. I just don't see a bona fide top 10 team in this league. You could argue not even a top 15, although I won't, because I still think Indiana's in that mix. I think Illinois can get there. I think Michigan can get there. And there's a bunch of, and then like from team 4 down to team 10 even. Like Iowa, I like. Wisconsin, I like. Maryland, I kind of like this year. Rutgers is going to get healthy. They're always feisty. Ohio State's young, but they're still Ohio State. Michigan State's young and unproven, but they're still Michigan State. Like Penn State's well coached. Minnesota's well coached, although they're talent depleted. And Penn State's actually better than people think this year. There's no easy road trips in the Big Ten this season. So it's a league where, as we know, life on the road is tough. And I think it's going to be a conference standings that looks a lot, everything's converging to 500 where you don't have any dominant 18-2, type records this year. No way.
I was in the upper level of the arena the last time the Big Ten won a national championship, 2000, and Michigan State wins it in Indianapolis. How surprised are you that we're sitting here 22 years later and we haven't had a Big Ten champion? Is that, I mean, you're a Big Ten guy. Yeah. You love following the league. Is this just a talent thing? Because I look at all these recruiting rankings all the time and I'm seeing SEC, Big 12, ACC. Yes. I see no McDonald's All-Americans coming into the Big Ten. I'm like, what's going on here?
I think it's mostly bad variance, bad luck, right? Like of the overall pie of factors, I'll give that, call it, 65%. I don't think the league's had like a dire demise into, no one cares anymore. No, it's still a phenomenal league. It's gotten deeper. It's also been passed by, I think, the talent acquisition you mentioned with the SEC, the ACC. Let's just be blunt. The Big Ten is typically more on the up and up with the recruiting approaches, right? The SEC is a little dirtier, Big 12 a little dirtier. So as we've seen the NIL thing now greenlit, the schools like SEC and Big 12 and some of the ACCs too have just kind of played that a little slimier than the Big Ten, and I think kind of hoarded some of that talent that used to go to the Big Ten schools. The style of play, I think, does matter. Big Ten, a little bit antiquated, always big man focused, physical, punching the mouth, a little more contrasting infusion of modern styles in the leagues, which has helped as the game's evolved. A lot of that thing, I think, does kind of matter, but mostly it's just been bad luck. I don't think the league's doesn't need to look in the mirror or anything. But unfortunately, this year kind of backs up that same no elite teams, no real national title contenders, a lot of real solid, competitive upper echelon squads, but none that really terrify. However, this is the one year though, there's not really a great elite team. So This is the year where a team like an IU or an Illinois or Michigan or Purdue, and maybe not Purdue, gets hot in the tournament. You can make a deep run, like a real deep run.
So you don't buy into any of the style of play in the Big Ten and teams
a little bit
cannibalizing themselves over the course of the regular season as being a factor?
I do think that matters, right? The example that my colleague Jim always points to was Kofi Coburn with Illinois. That teams, when you really put the Big Ten under the microscope, you can find deficiencies, specifically with attacking bigs and more traditional lineups, right? And so, look at the complete opposite of the spectrum. A team like Oregon, who always plays kind of that different makeshift type of team, lots of junk zone. Syracuse, another example, they play zone, but it's sort of to bring up nightmarish memories from 2013. But having some diversity in your back pocket stylistically, being able to be a chameleon, it does help you in a tournament setting. And I think the Big Ten has we are playing our way or the highway, and that's gotten them burned. Again, I don't think that is the prevailing reason. I just think it's been a little bit of bad luck and misfortune, and in a small sample size theater, anything can happen. However, I do think the style of play is partly at play.
Illinois is a team you like as well. I like them as well. What do you like about this team? You potentially think they can, put it? I don't think I agree with you right now. They're probably not the best team in the Big Ten because they're bringing so many new pieces together, and Underwood's gonna have to figure out rotations and how he wants to play because it's a brand new team in a lot of ways. But I like the talent. I like what they brought in. What intrigues you the most about this team?
Well, Brad Underwood's their coach. I think people forget that when you're appraising these rankings, right? You're going through. I put him up there with top 3, top 4 in the league. He's great. And he's proven. He's built elite teams, very recently. Terrence Shannon, Matthew Meyer, those are 2 of my favorite transfers of the entire offseason. Underwood got them both right. Both had somewhat down years last season. I think they're in for huge bounce backs, especially Shannon, who had a monster opening game. Coleman Hawkins is the unquestioned breakout candidate of the entire league. He had a 25 point. I know he played Eastern Illinois. It was a nobody, but he looked great. The question for them is point guard. And it's a major question mark when you're relying on a freshman, which it appears they probably will with Sky Clark, unless they just play Shannon at point guard. But I think the Big Ten in general has no good point guard. So the biggest weakness on Illinois in a typical year would probably knock them down a few pegs in my Big Ten rankings. But I don't feel great. I don't get the warm and fuzzies about any other Big Ten team's point guard. So if you kind of remove that as a potential disadvantage because no other Big Ten team has a good point guard, you look at every other aspect of the roster, coach, program, etc. I think Illinois shapes up to be the best team by a hair by March.
Michigan, another team that you're pretty high on. I am as well. I just like what they have with Hunter coming back and also assimilating some new pieces. They get Jalen Llewellyn from the transfer from Princeton. They've done pretty well for the most part. Juwan Howard the past couple seasons, he got Mike Smith, came in, was successful with him. It seems like he knows what he's doing just in terms of what he's bringing in from the point guard position. The Wolverines have an outside shot to win the Big Ten this year.
Yeah, I'm still not as sold on Llewellyn. I was a big fan of him at Princeton. I know there's a track record of bringing in the mid-major point guards. You mentioned Smith, and then last year Devontae Jones. Thank you. I think Llewellyn's in that class. I think he can be that type of piece, but I do worry about their guard play outside of him. It feels a little bit too reliant on their interior guys. Now, I'm a big Kobe Buffkin believer as well, but I think I use guards I actually like more than Michigan's guards. I just really like the coaching. Specifically with Phil Martelli sitting next to Juwan Howard. I know Indiana fans are going to roll their eyes when I praise Juwan Howard, but I think he's proven he knows what he's doing. I think Phil Martelli is really, really good with the clipboard. He's a huge part of that staff and kind of speaks to the many cases assistants are undervalued, right? I think that really top guys who are very much in the schematic designs of a lot of these teams and how they play and optimizing rosters and talent, all that stuff. I think that matters a ton. So I think Michigan, I give them a coaching bump. I give them a Hunter Dickinson talent bump, but I think their floor is pretty low. I could see a scenario in which they sort of fall out of the upper half of the Big Ten, even if they have a couple of injuries and their young guys don't really step up. So
you mentioned the point guard play. This kind of takes me back to Indiana for a second. Xavier Johnson is up and down. I mean, I kind of compare him to for an IU analogy, Troy Williams. Remember the good Troy, bad Troy? There was moments of Troy Williams looked like the best player on the court, and then other games he didn't do anything. Xavier Johnson is kind of in that same category in terms of being up and down. What do you kind of make of him going into the season? And is there a scenario where, Mike Woodson says, I'm going to put the ball in the hands of Jalen Hood-Schifino a little bit more because he gives me more upside? How does that all play out?
It's tough. I would like to see Hood-Schifino get a lot of reps early on, because what I don't want to see happen is what seemed to transpire last year, where when teams were doubling Trace and like really keying on TJD, it was sort of like, all right, X, kind of bail us out. We don't really have a lot of, Parker Stewart, more of a one-trick pony offensively, Miller Kopp, kind of a one-trick pony. So at least if you can play Hood-Schifino and Xavier Johnson together, you have two guys that can kind of make something happen. I know they're not either true shooters. You worry about floor spacing, but at least they're a threat to attack a closeout on a ball rotation, right? To get in the lane, to bend the defense. But having at least two guys is huge. So I think X's just having another sidekick like Hood-Schifino that can get in the lane and make stuff happen, operate in pick and roll, will help his game a lot. And I think vice versa. I think Hood-Schifino will be pushed by X in practice. I think he'll be helped playing alongside him. But in terms of X projection for the year, I just consistency. I don't know if we'll ever get it. But it's a great thing about Hood-Schifino, right? If he's not on, you can just roll with Hood-Schifino as your primary ball handler and then move rotations around that. You don't have to. It's not like X or bust, right? With X is on, you ride the wave. If he's not, you put him on the bench. You kind of cautiously utilize him in certain rotations, but you don't need him. That's the beauty about this roster. It's why I think the floor is so high. It's just hard to see a scenario in which IU is not really, really good this year.
You mentioned Phil Martelli being really good with the clipboard and the X's and O's. I'm curious what you watch Indiana closely. What did you think about Mike Woodson last season as a coach and a tactician in his first year? To me, the biggest complaint I heard from IU fans on a consistent basis was he talks about the second unit and these kind of mass substitutions where we have like four guys rolling in the game. I kind of agree. You said 7. I've always said, kind of 8 guys. I look at kind of some of those really good teams that Thad Matta had at Ohio State. You kind of go back and look at the box score. He's playing like 7 or 8 guys. Like when it got down to crunch time. And Indiana, people are wondering, well, how's Anthony Leo going to get to play? He's the 13th man. I'm like, well, on a really good team, you play like your best players and you either earn your spot in that rotation. So that's
I was gonna say Leo's going to play a lot throughout the year. He should. But when it matters in March, key crunch time, high leverage spots throughout the regular season and, potential marquee win opportunities, he's not playing, and that's okay. I think that's the depth is a double-edged sword, right? You need to use it and flex it to your advantage over the course of the year to wear teams down, to mitigate and plug holes with injuries, because every team has injuries now. That's what I think people are missing, is like how the rising prevalence of injuries. Having depth is important, but you don't have to use that depth so robotically, right? Which I think is what you're getting to, is how he uses rotations, almost like he had a cheat sheet. And like, I have to play this guy this minute, and at 16 minutes, I have to sub these 4 guys. And at 12 minutes, it's like a 7th grade basketball coach using like I don't want to make the parents upset, so I have to run through my little roster.
That's what I did when I coached girls basketball in like 5th, 6th grade.
Make the parents happy.
Excel spreadsheet, and this is who's going in when.
Right.
We like balance out the minutes. I'm not saying he did that. I just think, to me, like second unit is an NBA term, right? The last like legit second unit that I remember in college basketball is 2015 Kentucky, because they were actually a second unit that you like put players on the court that there was no drop off, and
right.
You don't see that in college basketball. So that's kind of one of the things I think I heard the most last year.
I will give him, I think he's done a nice job tiptoeing he kind of brings the NBA modern approach to how he wants to play and the style in which he wants to play, but he knows he has a baron, a beast inside TJD and even Race to a lesser extent. So I think he's done a good job trying to find a happy medium with those dudes. And then you're kind of working in the X factor, no pun intended, with all the other dudes around him. So it's a really tough riddle to solve. Like, it's a Rubik's Cube with spikes on it, it feels like. So I think we underestimate what a tough predicament Woodson has to work with here, just with all the kind of, there's a lot of moving parts, a lot of different styles of players, a lot of guys. It's a lot of dudes to choose from. I think he's done an okay job managing that, but I think his in-game strategic subs could be better, right? Playing certain guys when they're playing well, not playing certain guys when they're not playing well, not being super regimented. And I don't really have a take on like his sets or his scheme. I think it's, Jerry's still out. I think it's fine. But there's certainly room for improvement. And I think the bar at the upper echelon of the Big Ten and a lot of these other conferences is really high. So it's possible that Mike Woodson's a really good coach, but is he as good as Fran McCaffrey, X and O wise? Is he as good as Matt Painter? Is he as good as Chris Holtman? I think Greg Gard's terrific too. I think, and right under what I just mentioned earlier. So the bar's really high. It's a really high bar. You kind of have to remember that as well when you're evaluating Woodson.
Last thing before we get you out of here, kind of builds on the coaching thing. We heard for so many years about how Archie Miller was going to build this pack line defense and be a great defense, and it never really materialized. Mike Woodson comes in year one and puts the best defense in the Big Ten on the court. So I think that does speak to how he can build things on that end of the floor. I think last year they were a top 25 defense. What's realistic to expect in season 2 from a defensive perspective from this team?
I think top 15. I think it should be just as good as last year, if not better. It's hard to. Defense is more random year to year than offense. You're more at the mercy of how well your opponents shoot, who you play, et cetera. But the elite defenses typically are elite defenses year in and year out. And I do think this Indiana team is built to be a top 20 defense. Again, there's nothing fluky about what you saw last season. The key ingredient, every great defense, almost all of them have top end elite rim protection, right? Memphis, Oklahoma State last year had it. Gonzaga last year, like they're missing Chet Holmgren badly this year. We have that we have 2 guys with TJD and Race. So that gives you, again, a really stable foundation to build from. We're athletic. We're deep on the perimeter. I think we get after it. I think we play hard. I think Woodson has definitely instilled that kind of cultural, we're going to get after it mindset, which, as cliche as that is, effort is a skill on the defensive end. Attention to detail is a skill. So yeah, I feel good about that on the floor. The offense is where obviously we'll have a little bit of more of a turbulent ride, but still cautiously optimistic on the offense.
Matt, thanks for your time. Where can IU fans best follow you this season? And I know you're doing a lot of different daily shows and things like that with Field of 68 and some other things. What's the best way to keep in touch with you for fans who want to follow your work?
Yeah, I think just follow us at 3Man Weave at 3MW_CBB. We do daily shows with a few different networks. Field 68 is one of them. And we're still promoting the Almanac. So if you haven't purchased that, please do. For my own monetary benefit's sake, I guess. So that's it.
I pre-ordered my copy. It was very well done. I actually looked at your Bethune-Cookman preview as I was getting ready.
They're kind of talented, man. I'm telling you, Indiana better not sleepwalk. Top 100 recruit at Bethune-Cookman. That's like the college basketball. You see how 4 stars go in HBCUs. That's how you know the landscape's changing.
Absolutely. So. Well, Matt, thanks for the time. Thanks everybody for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of Podcast on the Brink. If you enjoy the show, please leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts. Leave us a rating on Spotify, and we'll talk to you again soon. Thanks everybody for listening.